Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Great Exhibition Road Festival. Our week of online events continues this afternoon with another one of our lunchtime chats. My name's James, and I work in the public engagement team at Imperial College London. We're one of the festival partners. Now, throughout this year's festival, we've been inspired by the upcoming climate conference in Glasgow, and we're looking at ways that are changing. Our planet is changing, and what we can do to prevent or adapt to the challenges that those changes pose. Today's conversation, the theme of it around extreme weather events, I think it fits very nicely into that sweet spot, and it's a highly topical area given recent events. Indeed, just this summer, we've seen unprecedented heat waves across North and West America, and a series of floods that brought really tragic events to Northern Europe. To help me explore this topic in more detail, I'm joined by a physicist-turned-climate scientist and as an Imperial alumni, a former Exhibition Road resident himself, is Dr Gabriele Messori. Thank you so much, Gabriele, for joining us.
Thank you, James, for inviting me, and good afternoon to everyone who's tuned in.
Now, Gabriele's now based at Uppsala University, where he spends a lot of his sort of professional life, anyway, looking at the statistical models that underpin climate models and the predictions of extreme weather events. Today, we're going to be looking at the effectiveness of forecasting these types of events in saving lives and preventing damage, and how climate change makes getting these early warning systems, these processes, especially important right now. So just before we do get started, I wanted to remind everyone who is watching at home that this is an interactive event. So please do send us your questions, your thoughts. My colleague Emma, she's working in the background. She's on the YouTube chat, and she'll be passing on your comments to me to read out and put to Gabriele. Please, could I just ask everyone, be considerate, be kind, and make sure don't ruin the experience for anybody else. So if that's all understood and we're ready to go, we can crack on with the event, I guess. So Gabriele, let's start with a sort of quite broad question. Could you give us all a sense of how weather forecasting works in 2021? What do we need in order to predict the weather in the modern age?
Actually issuing a good weather forecast is quite a complex thing to do. First of all, you need lots of data. So to issue a good weather forecast, we need to know what the weather looks like today in great detail. And to do that, we need, as I said, lots of data, and it's not easy or cheap to gather this data. We need data from weather stations, we need data from satellites, we need data from weather balloons, etc., etc. And there's millions and millions of observations that feed into the best weather forecast models out there. So first of all, we gather this mass of information about how the weather is today over the whole world. As I said, a lot of it comes from satellites out in space observing the Earth from a distance. Then once we have all this data, we need to feed it into a model that can help us predict, given what the weather looks like today, how it will evolve in the coming days. And again, developing these models, here we're talking about models that go into a computer. They're called in jargon numerical models. Developing one of these numerical models is, again, just like for collecting data, actually quite a complex undertaking. And here in Europe, we've actually developed over the last now almost 25 years what is considered one of the best forecast models in the world at a center that is partly based in the UK called the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasting. It's a collaboration of several European and a couple of extra European countries, and they both work on the data collection side and then on the model development side and on getting the forecast model to take into account the data. Because you have these two components, the forecast model and the data, and then you need to get the two to speak, so to say, so that the model can read in all this observational data about the weather today and use it to predict the future. And so it's really these two components and how they interact. And to run the weather forecast model, we need immense computing power. We're talking about needing one of the top 100 supercomputers in the world to run a fully blown state-of-the-art weather forecast model, essentially. So it is, I mean, putting out a weather forecast is not a matter of a clever bloke sitting at home with his laptop and doing some clever coding. It is really quite a complex and expensive undertaking.
Computational, yes, significant computational processing. Yeah. In terms of one, it might be quite nice to investigate something we hear in weather forecasts quite a lot and try and unpick that a little bit, and maybe that will reveal some of the mechanisms and the computational processing that goes into what we receive as a member of the public in terms of a weather forecast. So I was thinking in terms of when a weather person or says, there's an X percentage chance of rain on the day, what does that actually? I think we kind of have an intuitive sense of what it means, but it'd be interesting to know what it actually means from your perspective.
Yeah, so when we try and forecast how the weather will look like in the coming days, it is never a kind of 100% certain statement of what will happen. It's a bit, just to give you an example, it's a bit when you're driving and you can kind of second guess what that car coming in from a side lane is going to do, or that guy on the scooter that's trying to overtake you. Your brain kind of projects what you think is going to happen. But you don't know, you're never sure 100% what's going to happen, and that's why sometimes we have driving accidents. With the weather, it's a bit the same thing. So the model kind of tells us what is the most likely future outcome of the weather. But it never says, we never get an information that says 100% certainty, this is what's going to happen. And this is why often when we see a weather forecast on TV, we will hear someone saying, tomorrow there is an 80% chance of rain over southwestern England and the London area, for example. Now, it's actually quite hard so you can intuitively interpret what that means. If someone says 80% chance of rain, then you can think, okay, I better bring an umbrella because it's very likely that it's going to rain. But to actually interpret that information properly is not so easy. When the forecaster says 80% chance of rain, it means that if we had a perfect forecast, every 10 times you hear 80% chance of rain on TV, 2 times it's not going to rain. So you kind of, if the forecast was perfect, you would expect it to be wrong, in inverted commas, 2 times out of 10 if the chance of rain is 80%. Mm-hmm. Because when the forecaster says 80% chance of rain, you expect rain to follow such a forecast 8 out of 10 times. So almost by design, some of the times you're not going to get the weather that the forecast says is most likely. And so if you have an 80% chance of rain, you bring your umbrella and then it doesn't rain, it doesn't mean that the forecast was wrong or imperfect. It might still be a perfect forecast. It just happened to be one of those 2 times out of 10 when you actually wouldn't expect it to rain, given an 80% chance of rain. So we actually have a slide to kind of illustrate graphically this idea. The evolution of the weather is a bit like casting a loaded die. Okay, on a normal die, one has numbers 1 to 6 on the 6 faces. With weather, there are certain phenomena that are more likely to happen than others in the future. But as I said, we never have 100% certainty. So when we do a weather forecast, it's a bit like forecasting the outcome of a loaded die. So in this example, we have a die that has 1, 2, 6, and then 3 times the number 4 on 3 of the faces. So clearly here, the most likely outcome, if I toss this die, is to get a 4. And I've kind of assigned little weather symbols to each of the numbers. So we can say that casting a 1 corresponds to sun, a 2 to kind of partly overcast, a 4 to variable weather with a bit of rain, and a 6 to just a full-on rainy day. And in this case, if we had a perfect weather forecast model that was trying to forecast the weather based on casting this die, then we would see that, if you can go to the next slide, Emma, then we could see that the weather forecast should tell us that there is a 50% chance of kind of variable weather with a bit of rain. Okay, so this is the illustration of what that percentage that James, you just mentioned, actually means. But it doesn't mean that it's impossible to get a sunny day. We could still cast the die and just by chance we get a 1, even though it's not the most likely outcome. And it doesn't mean that the forecast is wrong.
I think that's such an interesting point. The idea that what you experience, it doesn't necessarily on an individual basis cast doubt on the predictive model underpinning the weather forecast. I mean, I guess if it keeps happening over a long period of time, maybe you can, maybe you can start to question it. But it's built into the prediction. If you're saying it's 80% chance that 2 times out of 10 it's not going to happen. I think.
Yeah, obviously, if you never get the weather that you expect, then there's something wrong with the forecasting system. But by design, you expect that occasionally it's not going to match.
I guess that I wanted to come on to sort of this. And this is going to be a part, sort of crux of this conversation. Is there's 2 elements to sort of predicting weather forecast in a sense. There's the prediction itself, and then there's the sort of the communication of that prediction and the understanding of that prediction and the sort of appropriate action being taken by the public, by local authorities, by governments. And I think that previous question around the sort of percentage of chance of rain might hint that sometimes the information that's conveyed, it doesn't always necessarily. Is not necessarily always understood the reality of what that actually means. I guess in your experience and some of the work you've done, is the threat posed by sort of extreme weather events that we're going to come on to in a second, is it more linked to difficulties of predicting the events themselves, or the communication side of things, and how to convey that to public audiences in a way where they act appropriately?
Well, I mean, it can be a bit of both. So occasionally we do get poor forecasts. That happens relatively rarely, but occasionally it does happen. In technical terms, they're called forecast busts. So a couple of years, there are some events where our numerical models just fail to forecast them appropriately. But I would say that in the majority of cases, it is actually more an issue of communication than of forecasting. Because as this example with the 80% chance of rain showed, it's easy to get kind of an intuitive grasp of what that means. But if you're a decision maker and you need to decide whether to take some very costly, economically costly and socially costly measures based on a probabilistic forecast, you need to go beyond an intuitive understanding and really evaluate what that probability that you're receiving means. And it is not easy at all to convey the details of what this means to a decision maker that may know nothing about weather. They may be a high-ranking government officer that works in a completely different field, and they may need to take a decision based on a probabilistic weather forecast. And that is far from easy. And there's several examples of good forecasts which were used in an ineffective, I don't want to say bad, but let's say ineffective manner, or less effective than could have been manner, which meant that some extreme weather events caused a vast amount of destruction and loss of lives, even though they had been forecasted reasonably well by modern standards. And one example I can bring up, Emma, if you can load the next slide. Yeah, one example I can bring up is a hurricane that occurred a couple of years back in Florida, in the United States of America. And here we see a map of the Caribbean and Florida on the top left-hand side. And this is a 3-day forecast for the hurricane. Okay, so this was issued on a Thursday afternoon for a Sunday. And the little black symbols with the M mark the forecasted most likely location of the hurricane in the coming days. And kind of the white area around these black marks shows where, according to the forecast, there was a high risk of the hurricane being. This is kind of your 80%, if you want, rain area, right? So it's not, the white area is what they call the risk cone. It's not the most likely location of the hurricane, but it's a region where the forecast said that there was quite some likelihood that the hurricane would be there. And if we zoom in on this forecast, Emma, if you can go to the next slide, yeah. If we zoom in, we see that we see the location of Miami there in Florida, and we see the position of the most likely center of the hurricane, which was shifted slightly to the east. And so in this type of situation, the question is, do you order a large-scale evacuation of a densely populated area, which is not located in the most likely, along the most likely track of the hurricane, but just in this risk zone, or not? And this is a dilemma that decision makers face relatively regularly, and they have learned now to address. But actually, if you go to the next slide now, and this just illustrates that in this case, the hurricane was always within the risk cone of the original forecast, but actually the hurricane center shifted by about 200 kilometers compared to the most likely location. And so in this case, some local authorities decided to evacuate, and other local authorities that were in the risk area but not along the most likely track decided not to force an evacuation. Right, and in some towns, this ended up being quite an unfortunate decision not to force an evacuation. And here the difficulty was getting local authorities to understand what this risk area or this risk cone meant and what the implications were. So yeah, this is just an example of how it can be difficult to interpret a forecast. And I see there's a couple of questions on this actually coming up.
I was just going to say one thing before I'm going to come on to the couple of questions you got sent in. I just think it's really interesting when you're saying, like, you know, the path of a complex system like a hurricane or something like that. You know, it's going to move around that sort of risk cone a little bit throughout its sort of progress, I guess, going from sort of where it was originally predicted, you know, where you had high percentages, and it might move into a lower percentage area, and then that changes everything again. It's a complex sort of route it will take, and it's never going to just follow the sort of the highest percentage probability areas the whole time, I guess. So that, yeah, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And for a local authority, it can be difficult to issue an evacuation order on the basis of a probability.
Yeah.
Right? The local politician wants to know, we are 100% certain you're going to get hit by a hurricane and you must evacuate, and it's an easy decision. But if they're told there's a 70% chance, they'll be wondering, well, but what's going to happen if I tell everyone to evacuate and then we don't get the hurricane because there's a 30% chance we won't get it, right?
Mm.
That's when it's difficult to make an optimal decision based on forecast information.
So in terms of the questions we've had, the first one from Alex looks at, I guess, about the sort of the prediction infrastructure, I guess, and quite a nice comparison between maybe, or a comparison between Europe and the US. So Alex asks, he says there's been a few tornadoes in Europe this summer. Is Europe prepared to provide the right forecasting, such as in the US in the tornado alley, and how will it communicate in advance to the population? So
in terms of the technical and scientific capability to do such a forecasting, we certainly have it. In terms of communication, Europe is has national-based communication strategies. So there are some centralized forecasting infrastructures, but the centralized forecasters do not play a role in how the information is communicated nationally. So for example, if there's a tornado or a storm or a forecast of flooding, the European forecast system will inform, for example, the French or the German ministry that there is a red warning for floods or for strong winds, but then they won't take any further action. Then it's down to the national political process to manage the internal communication and eventually what actions to take as follow-up to this forecast.
Great. And then the second question from Pete, maybe his ears were pricked by the mention of supercomputers. Yeah, it's understandable. So he's asked about sort of the current models predict sort of short-term days or long-term 100 years. He's asking about what sort of timescales would these supercomputers, what time scales are they able to predict now, and I guess if there's any hopes for improving that or providing a broader range of predictions with some reliability in the future.
Yeah, so we are quite good at predicting weather a couple of days up to a week ahead, let's say. And we are gradually moving to the point where we can make some relatively good forecasts on a seasonal scale.
Okay.
And by this, I don't mean that right now I can tell you what the weather is going to be in London in Christmas, but I can make a statement such as it is more likely than not that December in London will be warmer than usual, right? So this sort of not of average information about how the weather is likely to be during the season. On the other end of the scale, we have the so-called climate projections, where we give a picture of what is likely to happen in the next several decades to a century. The thing that is really difficult is the bit in the middle.
All right.
So from, let's say, 1, 2 up to 10 years, that is the really difficult part. Because up to seasonal scale, we can make kind of the statistical forecast saying the weather is likely to be warmer, colder than usual, stormier, or calmer than usual, etc., etc. On a kind of decadal and longer time scale, we can use climate projections and say, based on the way we humans are altering the climate system, we can expect this and this to happen. In the middle, it's kind of, when we speak about a couple of years up to 10 years, it's kind of a mix of these two things, because weather and daily variability is still important, and the long-term signal due to climate change is not so relevant if you're looking at a couple of years. It really emerges kind of on the decadal scale. And so there's this sort of black hole, this gap in between, where it's very, very hard to say something about the weather.
I guess, yeah, both sides, you're getting the demands of both. You're getting demands of longevity and also demands of resolution. When
exactly
those in the middle, it seems a bit more difficult.
Exactly. So we're quite good at the two extremes, and then as we converge towards the middle, it gets harder and harder.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thanks, Alex. Thanks, Pete, for those questions. Yeah, keep them coming, and I'll try and interweave them with the conversation that me and Gabriele are having here on screen. So the next area I wanted to take you is, the theme of the Great Exhibition Row Festival, sort of one world theme we've had this year. Climate change has been a big part of it, and we've certainly heard this year, I think, more than any year, and it sort of seems to be increasing that a particular weather event like the sort of flooding we've seen in Germany and Belgium was caused by climate change, or words to that effect. There's different variations in how it's said, I guess, or sometimes made more likely, I think people use. Can you give some sort of statistical perspective on that ability of scientists to sort of make statements like that?
Yeah, so it depends very much on a case-by-case basis when we try. So what one tries to do is ask whether a specific event, as you said, for example, the floods this summer in Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium, can be attributed to climate change or not. In some cases, we must say no. Such an event would have been possible and relatively likely also without climate change. In other cases, and this is the majority of the cases, we can make a statement as follows. We can say, such an event would have been possible without climate change, but climate change has made it a lot more likely, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, the floods in Germany were such a case. It is something which, in theory, could have been possible without climate change, but that our understanding of the climate system shows has become a lot more likely as a result of climate change. So we can't say that it was exclusively due to climate change, but we can say that climate change has made it more likely.
So again, it's that sort of individual basis versus like a wide, if you take a longer period of time, or if you have, I don't know, multiple versions of Earth, and like you can say that across that period of time, across those multiple Earth models, there is an increased likelihood, or an increased you'll see more of these types of extreme events, and you can say that increase is climate change related. But on an individual case by case basis, it's more difficult to attribute it with 100% confidence.
Exactly. I mean, to go back to our traffic accident example, imagine that there's a badly lit road without a pedestrian crossing, and someone gets run over at night along this road, right? So you can say, well, it's probably they got run over because there wasn't a pedestrian crossing. but you can't be sure. Maybe they would have been run over even with the pedestrian crossing. Maybe the driver was completely drunk, and even if there was a well-lit pedestrian crossing, they would have still run over the pedestrian, right? But you can say, well, I think that given the circumstances, given my understanding of road safety, I think that the lack of illumination and the lack of a pedestrian crossing has made this event more likely. Then obviously, if you have 20 years of data from that stretch of road, and you see that it has twice the pedestrian accident rate than a neighboring road with a well-lit pedestrian crossing, then you can say, yes, I know that the traffic infrastructure on that road makes people being run over more likely, but you can still never pinpoint with absolute certainty that single person that got run over to the lack of lighting. Because as I said, you can imagine cases in which even with lighting, they would have been run over. It's a bit this the question. So recapping, extreme events where we can't say they're due to climate change, extreme events where we can say that they have become more likely due to climate change. And then there's a third category, which is very rare and we are just starting to see, which is extreme events which would have effectively been impossible without climate change. And there we can actually say that this single event has, with absolute certainty, happened exclusively because of climate change. This is pretty unusual. One example where we can make this sort of statement actually is the heat wave we saw in North America this past summer, just a couple of months ago.
I think you used the phrase when we spoke before, virtually impossible without climate change. I don't know if you still stand by that statement, but yeah, for that particular event.
Yeah, exactly. So that's an example of an event where we really struggled to physically understand how such an event could have been possible without climate change. Next slide, please. Yes. So here we see the temperature anomalies during the heat wave, and the color scale, red means warmer than usual. The color scale saturates at 15 degrees Celsius above average. 15 degrees is the difference you have between kind of end of summer and full winter in many places on Earth. So 15 degrees above average is just something completely off scale. So this is an example where we really struggle to understand how this could have been possible without climate change. As you said, James, we can make the statement virtually impossible without climate change. So this is kind of the third class of events. So some we can't say they're due to climate change, some we can say that their likelihood or the probability that they would happen has increased due to climate change, and then some we can say that without climate change they would have been virtually impossible.
I mean, that intuitively, that event, when you were hearing temperatures in the mid to high 40s in Canada, it felt like something that we hadn't experienced it before, but it felt like a unique type of event that you don't get very often, and it felt like the dawn of it felt like something that you felt change was coming with events like that happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit kind of going beyond the limit of what we thought was possible. Really.
I just wanted to come back because there was a second part to Pete's question about supercomputers that we didn't get to. He was interested in how much the computing power needed would cost, and about some of the energy consumption associated with that. Obviously, we're talking about climate change now. We're trying to make green computation is a big issue in lots of areas. But yeah, in terms of the costs of the project you mentioned and the energy consumption, I don't know if you have any specific stats or just a general sense of what would be required.
Well, so this sort of initiative is funded by a consortium of governments. Mm-hmm. So many countries also have national weather centers, but this specific example on a European scale that I brought is funded by some 25 or 30 odd governments. And the cost of running such a center amounts to several millions of euros, if not tens of millions of euros every year, including the maintenance of the computer. So it is quite a significant, it's spread among many countries, but it is quite a significant financial and manpower investment. Because obviously there is a continuous model development and computing development associated with these forecasts. In terms of the energy consumption, I honestly have absolutely no idea. Because it's also highly dependent on where you put the computer, how you cool it, etc., etc. So in this specific case, I know they just moved the computer from the UK to Italy, but I have no idea what sort of energy consumption we are looking at.
Okay, sorry about that, Pete. But yeah, I think that hopefully Gabriel's answered the majority of your questions. So hopefully that's enough. In terms of a second, we've mentioned it before. Second event, I mentioned it in my introduction, which has been particularly notable this year. The sort of flooding events that we saw in Germany, Belgium, parts of Northern Europe, and they had some real tragic impacts on local communities and large numbers of fatalities, unfortunately. I wondered, in terms of, I know you've spoken before about some of the lessons that could have been learned from those events, and maybe that these are the sort of things we might very well likely see more of in the future as a result of climate change. Could the level of destruction be avoided next time if there are some lessons that could be learned? I wonder if you could talk about that for a bit.
Yes, so I mean, this case of the floodings in Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands earlier this summer, and here we see a photo that, if I remember correctly, was taken in a town in Belgium with a very flooded street. So this sort of event is an interesting example that goes back a bit to what we were talking about previously. How do you act on a weather forecast? Because in this case, there is such a thing as the European Flood Awareness System, which is a centralized forecasting system for Europe for flood risk and high water levels. And this specific event was forecasted relatively well. So 2 to 3 days before, we had a forecast that said that there was quite a high likelihood of something going very wrong in that area in terms of floods. But then, with some exceptions, this forecast wasn't used in a very effective way. And so many people weren't aware that their town was at a high risk of flooding. Many people did some pretty unwise things, but obviously when you have the floodwater rising, it's very hard to be rational. If you get the information before, you can plan things. If it happens all of a sudden, it's easy to criticize when you see the photos. I'm sitting in my dry room and I say that was stupid. But obviously, when you're there and you have that moment of panic and you see the water coming, it's easy to do silly things. So, you see people trying to move their car out of the way when there's half a meter of water rushing down the street. Don't risk your life to save your parked car. Let the car go and try and save your life. Or, people that drowned because they were trying to get valuable belongings out of their cellars. If water is rushing into your house, just leave everything in the cellar be and think about saving your life. So in that case, I think there was a very serious issue of lack of communication, because these are the typical things that you do when you're taken by surprise and panic, but that you wouldn't do if you had the information beforehand. Yeah.
And I guess there was probably, I don't know how common this, I don't know when the last time a similar event happened in this region, but I guess as human, it's almost human nature. Even if it happened in a lifetime or maybe the previous generation, we're quick to forget and sort of normalize situations, and then our sort of ability to assess risk, I guess, like you said, in that exact moment, when the waters come rising, it's understandable that people didn't always act, didn't act in the moment, didn't act rationally. I guess the key is having the information beforehand. And you said the predictions were quite good.
Yeah, I mean, there's two aspects to what you just said. One aspect is having the information beforehand to plan. And in this case, we saw that neither the kind of individual resident of the area nor the local governments had this preparedness and this planning ahead. Everyone was taken by surprise. So somewhere the communication chain at national and regional level of this forecast broke down. This is one aspect. The other aspect you bring up is that of human memory, which is actually surprisingly short. So there's studies about, for example, insurances which show that after a severe weather event, lots of people tend to take out insurance against it. For example, if there's a flood, people that didn't have it before will take out a flood insurance. But the amount of insurance people take out starts decreasing again rapidly just a couple of years after the event. So kind of already 5 years after the event, the amount of insured people has started declining quite rapidly again. Because, you know, you've paid 5 years of insurance premium, you haven't had any damage, and you think, well, do I really want to spend those extra couple €100 every year for this insurance that hasn't really paid out anything? And so there is quite a short memory on an individual level.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, that's even in that short time scale, even within a single person's sort of not just their life, but they're sort of living in that area. There's still sort of this nature of normalizing a situation or forgetting. Is there any intervention that could local authorities see insurance? I don't know. Maybe you can't see insurance premiums decreasing, or insurance policies being taken out less over a period of time, and act in a sort of public information safety perspective to address that. I don't know.
Well, I mean, from my point of view, the role of local authorities should be more, first of all, spatial planning. Mm-hmm. So if you know that there are locations which are sensitive to flooding or to strong winds or to whatever weather-related hazard you may be thinking about, then you should limit what buildings and what activities can be carried out in those areas. And we see in many European countries, there's a lot of leniency towards allowing to build in areas which are potentially high risk. Because, you know, you're a mayor, you're 5 years in term or 4 years in term, and you're told by scientists that you shouldn't build in an area that has a flooding risk of 1 every 50 years or 1 every 100 years. Mm. And you think, well, you know, I'm in office in the best of cases for 10 years, 15 years, and it's very unlikely to happen while I'm in office. It will probably never happen in my lifetime because, you know, maybe I'm a 50-year-old mayor and I think I'm going to die in the next 30 or 35 years or however long I expect to live. And I'm told that there's a 1 in 100 years risk of flooding in the area where I've just allowed a new residential complex to be built, right? It's hard to kind of weigh that information against the financial and social benefit that building in that area will bring.
It actually links to something. I think it's Yotti. I'm not sure exactly your name, but there's a comment here, a question here. Would it be possible to have infrastructure designs that withstand extreme weather events, negating the need for action such as evacuations? What you're describing there is kind of a design of policies around infrastructure development, rather than I don't know if there are like new materials or new approaches to engineering that could create sort of sustainability or resilience within places where people live. But it sounds like sort of the slightly more boring sort of land use and that type of infrastructure management it can have as much more effective, if not more immediate of easy effect.
Yeah, I mean, this question about infrastructure is an interesting one because obviously one thing you can do is say, well, I'm going to build really high flood defenses around the river, and then I let people build wherever they want because they're protected from the river. And this is an approach that many wealthy countries have adopted. And I say wealthy countries because you need lots of money to build major flood defenses or major defenses against whatever weather-related hazard you may be thinking of. But it comes with a big risk because you reduce the number of floods, but it is impossible to build an infrastructure for any possible flood, right? You usually dimension these infrastructures for a 1 in 100 year events. There is always the possibility that you will get a 1 in 200 years event, which will exceed the design of your infrastructure. And then the damage is a lot higher than you would have had without the infrastructure, because without the dams, you wouldn't have allowed people to build there. You've built this huge dam, you've allowed people to build there, and then this dam doesn't withstand an extremely rare, extremely unusual flood. And there's a lot more people in the floodplain than there would have been if the dam hadn't been built in the first place. So this complete reliance on protection infrastructure comes at some risk.
Yeah.
Not entirely risk-free.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about sort of the factors around human behavior and before, and there's another aspect of it that where in the world of sort of predictions and forecasts and appropriate action, and particularly around evacuations, which is kind of the boy who cried wolf mentality. So when an evacuation is legitimate, but the nature of the climate model and the sort of probability forecast that we mentioned at the top, you say it's an 80% one, you've got that 20% that you still have to factor in. Where you have an evacuation, but there isn't a large scale disruption, there isn't disruption, and people move back. It's sort of it's a bit of a cliche, but I think it probably holds true that it puts us in a mindset for the next warning where we're maybe not as willing to listen to it or more skeptical of it. Is there anything? I mean, does that play out in the real world as far as we know? And if so, is there anything we can do to sort of mitigate that?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to what we were saying about not taking decisions on the moment, but planning ahead. So at a national and regional level, one must have a decision framework which is already in place, and where, for example, one may have a decision framework which says if there is more than X% forecasted chance of this sort of extreme event, we automatically evacuate the local population. We can't rely on the individual decision maker who hasn't had any preparation for this to take such a decision maybe within a couple of hours once they get the forecast. There needs to be a carefully designed decision-making process in place, which in a way relieves the individual decision maker of the responsibility of making that call, right? Something that they can rely on and say, we order an evacuation because we have a national guideline that says so and so. And an example of a country which has quite a good kind of decision-making framework in place is the Netherlands, where obviously they've had their fair share of problems with flooding. And they have quite an effective decision-making framework in place for flood-related issues. Other countries don't have a clear pre-structured decision framework. It's kind of a matter of getting a forecast and the local administration having to make a rush decision, and then it's a lot less effective. You may have a really good person in place who is able to take this information and act optimally, or you may have someone who's not trained and not prepared for this and either takes no decision or takes the easiest decision, which is to do nothing.
So yeah, the Dutch and flooding. How does their decision-making process compare to another sort of area where you just expect events to happen? It's like, I don't know, Tornado Alley, like Oklahoma, that part of America. Is there a different? I don't know if the government structure in those two countries is different, so that influences the decision-making processes in those two countries around these different sort of extreme weather threats.
So I must say I don't know that much about the decision-making processes in the US specifically. In the Dutch case, as I said, they do have a predefined structure, so to say, for decision-making. So they're aware that flooding is a high-risk and high-impact event for such a low-lying country. And they have a well-defined communication chain. So if a flood warning comes, they know what to do with it. It's not sort of, who am I going to call? Who do I need to inform? They already have a list of kind of a chain of communication that they activate. And so no one needs to make difficult decisions in a panic moment because they know exactly who to inform. And there's also a clear structure to who needs to make what decision. For example, in the case of the German floods, there was a lot of discussion who should have made the decision. Was it this federal government who should have told people to evacuate? Was it the state? Was it the municipality? At which level should the decision have been taken? And obviously, no one was forced to evacuate, essentially, in Germany. While in the Netherlands, there is people know who should decide about what, and people know who should know about what. And that really makes the difference, because in these, when you get an extreme weather forecast, you're under high pressure. You need to take important decisions quickly. And so having a structure around you in which to rely ensures that you can make a better decision.
Yeah, I think we can always look for sort of technological or engineering fix, but often these sort of policy, that might not be quite as exciting, but these sort of policy decision-making structures that we build at government or local level are incredibly important. Okay, we're coming towards the end of the event, so I had one more question I was going to take from the comment section, which is a question from Pete, and then I'll have a final question for you, Gabriele, and then we'll finish up. So Pete asked, we seem to be having a lot more 1 in 100 events than pure statistics would suggest. Why is that? How do we define 1 in 100 years, and what impact might climate change be having?
Well, so we define 1 in 100, when you say 1 in 100 years events, it means it's an event that has a 1% chance of occurring during any 1 year. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to occur exactly once every century. What we are seeing is that we are indeed getting more 1 in 100 year events than we would statistically expect. And this is the sort of case where we can say climate change has made a heat wave or a flooding event or a strong wind event more likely. It's because we are getting more of these than we would expect based on the historical data we have. This is exactly what I was talking about previously with saying that climate change makes some extreme event more likely. Yes, so I think this pretty much answers it.
Great.
And then if we have time, there was another question from Alex.
Yeah, go for it. Alex, where was it? Yeah, Alex asked, the WEF has predicted that 60-degree temperatures will be the new normal in some areas of the globe. How can we forecast some much ahead? How can we monitor if the current changes in regulations will have positive or negative impacts?
Well, in terms of forecasting, so I assume it was so much ahead. Mm-hmm. As I said, once we go into several decades ahead, we have a good grip on. It's not so much forecasting, because we don't say this specific day or this specific season will have a heat wave. It's more of projection. We say that we expect maximum temperatures in this area to exceed 50 degrees or however much in 30 years' time. So it's not so much a forecast as a projection. But as I said, once we go on these very long time scales, it's really the long-term trend in the climate that becomes important. So it's easier to forecast than if you ask about next year. So that we can forecast. And in terms of monitoring if current regulations will have a positive or negative impact, that is actually quite hard. In some cases, it's pretty easy. For example, if you say, okay, we're going to ban older cars from circulating in central London, then it's pretty easy to measure that the particulate matter concentrations drop. In other cases, it's extremely hard. For example, you say, well, I'm going to ban I'm going to shut down all my carbon power plants, which you expect, well, will have a great impact. But then you need to check where the power will instead come from. If you start importing more oil because you need to fill in the energy gap that has been created by closing down a coal power plant, then perhaps it's not such a brilliant policy. So it can be very complicated to actually evaluate the impact of policies.
Great. Okay, so the final point I wanted to make was, and the question I wanted to ask, I guess. So, we're in a situation now where even if we get, more than we expect out of COP26, and there is a certain degree of climate change sort of locked in, unfortunately, and from what we understand, that is going to make extreme weather events a more common occurrence in various places around the globe. If you had an audience with, I guess, firstly, if you had an audience with the communities who live in some of those most affected areas, what's the one piece of advice you would give them? And I'm going to ask the same question, but if you had the audience with all the local authority leaders or the authority leaders. But if we start with the communities who live in those areas, what would be your sort of quick takeaway advice that they should, in terms of their behavior, in terms of what they should be reading, that type of thing?
Well, I would say that informing themselves on what is likely to happen is key. to a large extent, there's nothing you can do on a very local scale which will change the big picture. So if you're thinking about the local scale, I think informing oneself as much as possible so as to not be surprised is the best advice I can give. I mean, we have a good idea of the general changes that will happen in many regions of the world, maybe not very specifically, whether something will happen in Reading or in London sort of thing. But if you think kind of England scale or Western Europe scale, we have a pretty good idea. And so I would say that the top tip is to inform oneself about what we expect will happen in the region where one lives.
Great. And then if you had the sort of local authorities' ear for a session or for a quick, a quick chat in an elevator, for example, what your advice to them be?
Again, to have a clear planning structure at multiple timescales. Mm-hmm. Both the timescales of the local government, so a couple of years, and longer-term planning timescale. You can't only plan based on the political cycle. You need to have longer-term planning systems because many things require 10, 20, 30 years to be set in place.
Perfect.
Okay. So plan on multiple timescales, I would say, would be my key advice.
Brilliant. Okay. Thanks so much, Gabriele. Unfortunately, that sort of does bring us to the end of this sort of lunchtime discussion. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise, your views on the sort of present reality of weather prediction and extreme weather events, and what we advise on what we as individuals, as citizens and decision makers higher up the chain, what they need to be doing now to sort of ensure that some of the events, the tragic events we've seen this summer, aren't repeated in the same way going forward. For those who are watching live on YouTube, sorry if we didn't get to all of your questions or read out your comments. I will say a recording of this discussion will soon appear on the Great Exhibition Road Festival YouTube channel, so you can watch it again or share it with friends or colleagues or family members. I would say also all future live events, recorded sessions from the festival will be appearing on this YouTube channel. So I would encourage you, do follow us. There's a click follow button lower down. You can get little notifications every time we have a new event or a video that's been posted. My colleague Emma is also going to post in the chat an evaluation form. So if you could take a couple of minutes just to fill that in, that would be really, really helpful. You can give us an idea of sort of future events you might want. There is also, I've heard, there is a prize for one person who fills in one of the evaluation forms, is a £50 voucher. So there is an incentive, as well as making our events better. There's a sort of a personal, selfish incentive to throw your name into the hat for winning one of those prizes. I'd also say we've got 2 more events on the Great Exhibition Road Festival this week. So we've got the Unloved Animal Club. We're going to be looking at some of the species that are threatened by climate change from around the world, and some of the scientists are going to be making the case why we should love these maybe less poster child type species more. And then we've got a family quiz to round off the week with contributors from the Natural History Museum and the Science Museum. So yeah, if you aren't signed up to those, please do sign up to those. But otherwise,
thanks again, thanks for having run this session and for having invited me to take part.
Well, thank you so much, Gabriele, for sharing all that, and thanks to everyone who tuned in, and please have a good rest of your Thursday afternoon. I think that's about it from me. So yeah, have a great time. Thank everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.